Good afternoon and welcome back to Leadership Insight. This is where we sit down with executives who are shaping strategy, operations, and transformation inside complex healthcare systems. Today's guest is Chris Rieder, Chief Information Officer at Colonial Management Group. Chris brings nearly 4 decades of experience leading enterprise IT across multi-state healthcare organizations. He scaled IT operations across 20 states, led organizations through M&A, modernized EHR platforms, driving tens of millions in revenue growth. He's built enterprise functions and established cybersecurity and governance frameworks at scale. Chris, it's great to have you here with us today.
Eric, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, Chris, before we get into the strategy and governance, you've been doing this for almost 40 years. Mm-hmm. That doesn't really happen without real drive. Where does your energy come from?
Well, I come from a very athletic background. I have the opportunity to continue to be an athlete. I still play competitive tennis. In fact, I had a match on Tuesday of this week in doubles. So that's part of where it comes from. I have younger children, most recently now a stepchild who's going to be 9, I believe, in the next couple months. So got to be able to keep up with him. And my fiance is also quite energetic. So just not going to slow down anytime soon. You know, I have family that's in their 80s and my mother still plays concert violin in a orchestra up there in Northern Virginia. So an awful lot of energy for somebody.
Excellent. Well, I commend you on that. I cannot imagine the energy it takes to chase after a 9-year-old.
It's all fun. It's all great.
Well, you don't sound like somebody that has retirement on the horizon, do you?
No, sir. Absolutely not.
Yeah. You know, you had mentioned something in your note that I really liked, the evolving role of the CIO as a strategic executive partner. When you first stepped into leadership, what was the CIO expected to be?
It was very much keeping the lights on. I mean, there was an article back in the early 2000s, or a book actually published, that talked about whether IT really matters, Harvard Business Review, a snippet of it as well. And to me back then, it was, how do we keep costs down? How do we make sure that the lights stay on, the ubiquitous, throwing the power switch? And how do we just maintain what we have? That was very much the way IT used to be. It has changed significantly since then.
So it sounds like it was more on the hardware and software side. How has that evolved? And, what is it now?
You're right, Eric. It actually was very much on the infrastructure side. Today, it's very much a strategic seat at the table. It's part of how are we going to make a difference with the revenue at the top line and the bottom line? How are we going to make sure that we are making a difference with what we deploy and where we put our resources? And how is that strategic for IT and having a seat at that table? So that has been one of the biggest changes. And then you really have to have executive influence. You have to be able to speak the language of the company, not technology language, but the actual business language.
That's really novel in a CIO, Chris. When did you realize that IT could actually drive revenue, not just support it?
About 20 years ago, I was working in the pharmaceutical business, and we had a CRM system, customer relationship management, but it was very manual. And we decided we were going to go with a much more automated system. Well, as a result of doing this incredibly large rollout across the whole country, it was clear to me that IT is no longer just keeping the lights on, but we were actually able to get the sales representatives into one more doctor's office per day, which means that there was going to be an impact on the revenue and that there was going to be an increase in the revenue just based upon rolling out this new system. That's when it all started to connect and click with me, which is we're not just there to keep the lights on, we're there to actually be an executive partner. Interoperability is incredibly important in order to be able to get the data to talk to each other. But how are we going to make sure that IT is actually making a difference in the business moving forward? And that was in the early 2000s when that really started to hit home for me.
Well, yeah, I think IT can definitely drive revenue, and you've certainly proved it. Still today in today's market, a lot of executives still think IT is overhead. And you've obviously proven that otherwise. What has to change in leadership mindset for IT to become that growth engine?
I think that's a great question, Eric. I think there needs to be data visibility. And by that, we make decisions very quickly, but we want to make sure that we're making the right decisions with the right amount of information. And that has changed quite a bit in the way in which executives look at IT. It's no longer just a cost center. The reporting automation, how do we make sure that we're getting the reports every single morning, every single day, or on demand whenever we may need them? And then how do we eliminate inefficiencies? We're consistently looking at the manual processes versus the automated processes, and decision velocity is continuing to increase. That's never going to slow down. So how do we make sure that we continue to have the right data and the right information in front of the folks that are making the decisions at the right table?
Well, listen, when you walk into a board meeting, I'm sure you're not talking about infrastructure. Are you talking about margin, or what are you talking about?
We have to speak the language of a board member, and board members are definitely not looking at infrastructure. They're not looking at whether we have the most recent servers or whether we have the right interconnectivity. They want to know, how is IT going to help move that business forward? How's it going to increase the stock value? How's it going to increase the margins, the EBITDA? How do we make sure that it's actually making a difference in the business? So when I walk into a board meeting, I'm presenting at the board level. It's really important that everybody understands who their audience is and what drives that currency of the company, or how they measure success.
Excellent. So, in today's society, the internet, social media, AI is really taking precedent. Healthcare right now is really under serious pressure when it comes to cyber risk. What keeps you up at night?
Certainly that cyber risk pressure that you talk about. I mean, we are, healthcare as a sector is not slowing down when it comes to the penetration attempts. We have all these rules in place, the HIPAA and the PHI and the high tech and all the different cyber liability insurance that we can muster, but they're still continuing to come after the personal information of our patients or individuals. So what keeps me up at night is making sure we have the right technology in place, whether it's hardware, whether it's software, whether it's agreements with different entities. I'm part of InfraGard, which is an FBI branch that ultimately is for individuals to be able to ensure they know from an infrastructure perspective, where are the attacks happening? Where are they actually trying to go next? And what do we see? That's a lot of what keeps me up at night, making sure that we are able to get through a JCO audit if you're in the world of a hospital, for example. But between the HIPAA and the high tech and all the rest of the rules from a PHI perspective, that's what I have to be very careful of to ensure that our data is not only secure, but that our data is in a place that will not be compromised.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of bad actors out there,
Yes.
and really trying to access that HIPAA information.
Very
I
much so.
understand why it keeps you up at night. So, Chris, share with me, what does mature governance actually mean inside a healthcare organization?
So we have a lot of different regulations as part of governance. We need not just an individual that's cybersecurity inside of a IT organization, but we need a chief data officer. We need somebody who is, and that's been a dual role of mine in my past 4 years, CIO and a CDO, where you're ultimately making sure that you're following the HIPAA and the high tech rules. You're ultimately making sure that you have good partnerships with vendors, because vendors can step in and ultimately help ensure that there's enough of a firewall and enough of a protection there. And then the other part of it is it needs to be visible enough to the entire organization. Sitting at the C-suite, having these weekly, monthly meetings, for example, we need to make sure everybody's aware of what's happening and why. Phishing tests that everybody used to laugh at, coming through email, is something that's very prevalent today and very important. And we look at making sure that we're within a certain percentage standard in order to make sure the company is safe. And I think that's an example of what needs to continue to happen.
So you mentioned that a lot of the senior executives are aware of the potential risk. Do you think a board understands the true exposure their facilities are exposed to?
I don't think board members are entirely aware of what that risk looks like. If they've been exposed to it in another business that they may be a part of, maybe they have a bit more familiarity. There are certainly board members that try to stay current with, podcasts like this one and other, entities, but I don't think they realize exactly how invasive this is and how penetrative it is. There are companies that are dedicated to doing nothing but this kind of review and this kind of protection, and I employ those companies in order to ensure that we stay protected. It's the board member side that I need to make sure they realize why we're making the investment and what the exposure really means. I mean, it's been happening every quarter, it seems like. So they are not as aware of it as I feel they need to be, which is part of my role to ensure that they are educated.
So it sounds like that you've been very successful in making these boards aware of that risk.
Mm-hmm. Mhm.
Are there certain tacks that you take that make it successful and make them hear and understand?
So some of those tacks I take is showing where they have tried to penetrate or where they have been successful at penetrating. I mean, healthcare billing, for example, was very highly penetrated, if you will, in 25. And so I make sure that they're aware of what that meant and what kind of ransom had to be paid and what that did to the actual data itself, for example. So I try to use as many real life examples as are out there. And then you can also show them how easy it is for these types of things to happen. I mean, if board members bring technology into our boardroom, there's a certain level of scanning that has to happen before I'll allow them to actually connect. And it's easy for me to show them why that's so important.
Excellent. Well, I think that's something I hope some other IT leaders learn from this podcast. I think you're taking a great approach.
Thank
So you've integrated systems across multi-state organizations. When that merger or acquisition happens, what's the first thing that most leaders underestimate?
Cultural alignment is probably the first one. You have to understand the culture of your organization, which most of us do, but what is the culture of the new organization that you're merging with or that you're acquiring? And how does that work with your actual deliverables and what timelines do you put people on and what kind of expectations do you have? And then it's interoperability. What systems, and typically you look at this before you even do the acquisition, because that can have an accretive impact on the value. If I have systems that are so disparate that don't talk to each other, and now I've brought in a new organization, we need to make sure that we have a solution or a bridge or an interface that's going to ultimately make that happen. And those two things at the very beginning need to be looked at, not just seriously, but also very in depth, in some cases before you even do the acquisition, in order to ensure that you're ready for what that means so that it does not have that accretive impact or that you are not having to make an immense investment in order to get all that data working. And then it's patient care. I mean, that continuity, the patients don't know that there's suddenly been a merger or an acquisition, nor do they need to necessarily know. Well, all they need to know is that their care is going to continue the same way it has in the past. And we can't let that acquisition or the systems or the disparity have an impact on patient care.
Excellent. I appreciate you sharing that. So, what is your approach? When you do an acquisition in the first 90 days, what do
Mhm.
you implement?
So I like to look for a PMO, project management, in order to make sure that we're actually in control of who's responsible for delivering what pieces of that integration. So I like to see Gantt charts. I like to make sure I've got the right people assigned to the right roles. You have that typical vertical line and you say, okay, here's where we're going to be today. Here's where we're going to be in a week from today. What does that integration look like and what's the roadmap? Where are we at 30, 60, 90 days? Where are we at 180 days, a year, 2 years? And how long is it going to take us to make sure that the governance as part of that implementation integration is indeed actually working the way we expect it to, because that doesn't change. But what we need to do is make sure we have measurable outcomes, because what gets measured gets done. I have an old CEO
Right.
that used that phrase. We've seen it across organizations. I like to continue to use that to make sure everybody knows what the expectation is. They know how they're being measured and they know why they're being measured.
Inspect what you expect, right?
Yeah, exactly. Good.
Excellent. So you've been very clear in our conversations. You're not looking for that short-term hired gun role. What kind of environments bring out your best work?
I mean, most of the best work comes in environments where you're part of that C-suite. You are at the table when we are talking about the direction that the company wants to go in. You are sitting with your peers, whether they be the other C-suite folks or whether they be the other senior executives, so that you can get to the truth and the information as quickly as possible. So you want to be looking at, what is my long-term stability for the organization? What is the budget responsibility that I'm going to have for the organization? And how is IT central to the business? That to me is particularly critical, because while it may not be an IT business, you still want IT to be part of that strategic outcome, and you want it to be
Absolutely.
part of the value you're bringing every single day. And then what is the company itself as far as stability goes? Is it a startup? Is it a medium-sized organization? Is it a mid-size? Is it large? The mid-size to the startup to me is super exciting, because you make such an impact so quickly. But we need to make sure that IT is indeed part of the strategic value the business brings.
Well, you had shared, that you have senior execs, CEOs that some believe, some don't know. What type of leaders do you enjoy working for? for?
Some of the best leaders I've worked for are the ones that really understand what motivates their direct staff or their direct reports, because there's different things that motivate different individuals. In some cases, it's a work-life balance. In some cases, it's monetary. In some cases, it's recognition. In some cases, the chance to be outward facing. So when the senior executive or the CEO or the president of the organization ultimately takes the time to understand what motivates me and what motivates the other senior executives that report into him or her, that is a great fit, because that's what I do. I want to make sure I know what motivates my direct reports so that I'm talking to them on the right scale and the right standard so that they will
Right.
listen to when it becomes a real deliverable or a real pressure opportunity. That's what I like, and that's the direction that I look for in my leadership.
Yeah, I think sometimes that's like pushing a ball uphill, right? I mean, some are accepting, some aren't.
Yes.
I mean, the AI technology today, I love it and I hate it, right?
Right. Yeah, that's a
Um,
great point.
so if you look down the road 3 to 5 years, what do you think will define a great CIO?
I think CIOs are going to have to work on what are we going to do with this AI? How are we going to manage it in order to ensure that it's not a misinterpretation of what people are hearing in the regular news or in regular publications. So whether it's augmented intelligence or artificial intelligence, there's different applications for how we're going to leverage this actual outcome. So that's one that's going to be part of it. Data governance is always going to be very important to us as an organization. The cyber resilience that we talked about before, that is just not going to go away. We're going to have to continue to look at that 3 to 5 year window. And then lastly, how do I make sure that I'm aligning with the revenue of the business? It's an enterprise influence. It's an enterprise deliverable, not just an individual technologist. So that's going to be part of it as well.
Well, Chris, I really appreciate the depth you brought to this conversation. And I think there's a lot of good information that other IT leaders can glean from it. You don't just talk about IT, you talk about that enterprise responsibility, that revenue accountability, and that growth engine, and that leadership influence. So I really appreciate you being here.
Well, Eric, thank you very much. And I appreciate you letting me expand upon what IT ultimately will look like in the next 3 to 5 years. So thank you.
Well, to all of our viewers and listeners, thanks for joining us for the Leadership Insight episode. If you found value in today's conversation, drop a comment, share it with your colleagues, and hit that like button. We look forward to continuing these conversations with you. See you again next time.